In what follows, I would like to give a quick overview of how you can do elections on a blockchain. Now, in principle, it's easy enough. You just ask everybody to send a coin to an address, and the address corresponds to a candidate or an answer to a question or whatever it is you want to vote about. So, and then the address that gets the most coins wins. But of course, it's not quite that simple, because if you have a lot of coins, you could just send all of them to an address. So at least you need to verify that each voter only sends a single coin, or they all send the same amount. And even there, that's not good enough, because anybody could, in principle, send from a lot of different addresses. So you need to know that only the registered voters, or those you want to vote, can vote. And this needs to be done anonymously. So you need to somehow or other register the addresses without knowing who's the person behind the address. And this is where an authentication server comes in. So the first step is to set up an authentication server. Now this is a very simple example. It was done at the University of Iceland in cooperation with the TutorWeb project, which runs tutorweb.net. And the way this is done is that the TutorWeb generates an anonymous ID, and the anonymous ID is simply a message, a string if you like, followed by a signature by a TutorWeb address. And this is all you need to know that, for somebody else to know that you're a vetted voter. The TutorWeb doesn't store these. It is linked to the University of Iceland student registration system. So any student can go in, they log into the student registration system, which automatically sends a validated ID to TutorWeb, and the TutorWeb returns this collection of strings, which basically are a unique anonymous ID for that particular individual. And anybody can verify that this particular string has been signed by this address. So anyone from the outside does not need to know anything other than this. They don't need to know who the individual is. They simply know that this individual is a student of the University of Iceland and has been vetted for this election by the TutorWeb. Now, ideally, the students shouldn't get all this mumbo jumbo. Ideally, they should just return a single simple link. It could, for example, point to the web wallet, and we'll get to that. Now, but what the students need to do is to set up a web link to do the actual registration of the address. And this weird looking link here is simply a voter registration mechanism, where the user has, the student has taken their address, appended it to the end of all the gunk that's over here. And ideally, if the TutorWeb just provided a link to the wallet would do this automatically. So this whole thing would be a one-step process to register a new address, and the wallet would just automatically generate the address. This is fairly easy to do. It's just a couple of days of work for somebody who knows how to program the wallet. But at this stage, each user, each student, or whoever is going to vote has registered, and they've registered a particular address. So they've registered anonymously. And this results in a string being returned like this. It simply says this address has been registered as a voting address. And now we need to look at what the election administrators have to do. they have to take all these addresses. Remember, this link here was called, so it has stored this address already. The administrator just has to take them and make sure that they're unique and prepare a list properly. So this is easiest done using simple Linux commands. So for example, here is a small script which will look at the list of voters and simply make sure that they're unique. So here you'll see that is this long anonymous string, and here's the address they registered. And you can see here that the same person may register multiple times, and they might in fact register different addresses. All of that is fine, as long as you make sure that the last address overrides everything else. So now to pick up the votes, we use a small shell script, a homemade shell script, which simply sets up the commands needed to define an election. And the commands to define an election are based on work done by in a project that's at GitHub. So it's github.com/Ingimarsson with a capital I/colorvote. And then here you'll find all the software needed to do this. And basically what you have to do is you have to set up a small set of Python programs which can scan the chain looking for any elections. You can then check to see whether you have some unspent smiley coins, and then you can create a new election. And you create the election using an address which has some unspent smiley coins. So because you need to register the election in the blockchain, and that corresponds to a transmission into the blockchain, and that corresponds to spending some smiley coins. So here's a simple election called Trump or not, and then the next step is to issue votes. So you go back as an administrator to the, and you can see how this works. You issue votes to take part in this election, and you list all of the addresses that are supposed to take part, and you list how many coins are sent to each one. We're just sending one smiley to each one of these two addresses. And in general, you may want to make this more complicated. You may, for example, want to send them to a whole class of students or to 1,000 individuals or however many you want. And that will correspond to something like this longer command here, or something which comes out of our little script. And then, having generated the election and sent the one token to all of these, you should also send them at least one smiley each, which is the transaction fee for each one. So now all the voters have received a colored coin, and if they go into their wallet, then go into their smiley coin wallet, they will see that they are allowed to vote. So this then corresponds to a certain election, and it corresponds to the particular election which was set up by the administrator. So now we're at the stage where the voters can vote. And remember, the voters got an anonymous ID, they registered an address with the voting authorities. The voting authorities sent them a token to that particular address, a colored coin, and they will then vote by sending that colored coin to their candidate. So someone has to produce a list of candidates, and that's just another list of addresses. And then the voters can send to those addresses. And then the final step is simply to take a look at where those addresses land. And there's a website called explore.colorvote.org for this purpose. And of course, all of this is mostly demonstration still. So here's, for example, a survey on how good coriander is. You send out all the colored coins, and so that's where the coins are. Initially, each one of the initial addresses just has a single colored coin, and then the two addresses corresponding to I love coriander or or coriander tastes like soap will get more votes than the one. So down here somewhere is the I love coriander address, and up here is the coriander tastes like soap address. And the others simply haven't voted yet. And that concludes this session on how you can set up voting in a secure manner, anonymous manner, and fairly easily tally the votes afterwards. Now it's obvious that there are things you should do better. For example, one should have here the ID for the election in case you have you're asking many questions. For example, you might want to send out one colored coin for each question, so you would want to identify them in a more clear manner than just using the address, so that would be the election part. And then ideally you would also identify the options better. For example, here they should be registered, the candidates should be registered in the blockchain, and they should be easily accessible therefore within the wallet itself when you're looking for a candidate address. So rather than having to punch in an address that you like here. And that concludes our session on elections on the blockchain.